Welcome back. Welcome back. I'll give everyone a couple seconds to filter in here. We are here today to talk about fear and contagion with Heidi Larson. So Heidi is the founder of the Vaccine Confidence Project, which tracks vaccine rumors and works with national governments to help address them. She's also a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, author of Stuck: How Vaccine Rumors Start and Why They Don't Go Away. And she is a recent MacArthur winner, which I just learned today, which is a huge honor. And we are so delighted to have you with us here today, Heidi. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks.
So just a note, this interview will run for about 45 minutes and then we'll transition to Q&A. So if you have questions for Heidi, please drop them in the chat. We will call on you at the end of the session and be ready at that time to unmute yourself. And Heidi, I just want to point out really briefly for you that I'm wearing my favorite t-shirt for you here today in honor of this interview, which says so many likes when all we need is love.
I love it.
So I wanted to ask you more about the Vaccine Confidence Project and what you guys have seen more recently. So I know you have a series of analysts trained in everything from digital media to political science, artificial intelligence, psychology, statistics, epidemiology, computer science, and you've been tracking a lot of social media and misinformation around vaccines. And I remember about a year ago, the Center for Countering Digital Hate published a pretty famous report that found that 65% of anti-vaccine content was attributable to 12 people online. And I'm wondering if that's consistent with what you all are seeing now. Has that changed, or what is the most recent information that you're seeing coming?
The dirty dozen, as they call them.
The disinformation dozen.
The disinformation dozen. Well, we look at a lot more than just the disinformation. I mean, that's part of it. We're out there trying to listen to the whole range of discourse around vaccination and what it's embedded in and where it's coming from. We actually started with online news media in 2010 because social media wasn't nearly as ubiquitous as it is now, but we've increasingly moved into social media. And now a lot of that's going even more underground. So the more restrictions that go in this space, the more it goes to other darker spaces. So that's been one pattern we've seen, which is probably no surprise. The nature of it has also changed. I mean, we look very globally, and what's driving, and my particular interest has been how different political situations, cultural situations, what's driving it. Because if there's one thing that we've come out of this decade or 12 years since I founded the Confidence Project, is how deeply embedded vaccine acceptance is in trust in government. It's far more correlated with people's perceptions of government than it is about any other socioeconomic demographic variable. And it's come out particularly strong in terms of COVID. It's really varied. We've been looking at these networks. The US is a huge propagator of a lot of the conspiracy that is across Africa and across a number of other countries. We also see a lot of US funded groups that are resisting vaccines in different settings that we can track back to the US. I think it's, but there's a lot of it that is not funded. It's spontaneous. It's driven by sentiments, emotions, and some of it, a lot of people just stumble into because they're looking for, information on vaccines. But I think we also have to remember that this is not just an online issue. And I think sometimes we get so focused on the online piece of it that we forget this cascade of, in some of particularly the poorer countries, you might have one device for a village. and somebody can do a print screen from one WhatsApp image and then go, read it in the mosque, read it on the radio, photocopy it and tack it on a tree. And these things have a whole cascade effect. And I like to look much more at the ecosystem of how things travel. I would say in 2018, I wrote a piece for Nature. They asked me to write a commentary in the context of between H1N1, Ebola, Zika. There were a lot of discussions, roundtables, committees, left, right, and center on are we ready for the next big one? And they had asked me to write on that. And I said that I thought one of the biggest pandemic risks was going to be viral misinformation. But I have to say that's absolutely been the case, but it's been far worse than I could have ever imagined. We have watched the global social media space around vaccines. It's been explosive in terms of, and it's probably not surprising because before, it was there were certain groups that had some interest in vaccines for one reason or another. Some of that was being used as a platform for other things, other ideologies, trying to sell natural products. There was a lot of that going on. Alternatives, because when you have some people saying don't take the vaccine, other people see that as an opportunity and leap in, well, I've got something else that's going to make you feel better, and a whole mix of different alternative health therapies. But in the context of COVID, because it's everyone, it's starting to affect everyone. I'll tell you, 3 years ago, I didn't think truck drivers would care an iota about a vaccine, never mind starting a convoy. I never thought barber shops would be a place that people would be, trying to communicate and build trust around vaccines in some communities. Bangladeshi restaurant owners in London getting part of the story, and in different parts of other areas in the world. But in COVID, the whole vaccine conversation has morphed with a lot of other anti-restrictions. It's much more now about resistance to being told what to do, to being restricted. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of emotion. And I have to say, I don't think we've ever seen in history such aggression and violence towards scientists. I have colleagues who have had death threats because their science was what was behind a restriction. So it's a new.
So why do you, you study the cultural, trends behind that. Why do you think that is? What is it about this moment that is more?
Well, I think we've been in a pressure cooker for 2 years. Hyper uncertainty. In my book Stuck on why rumors, how they start and why they don't go away. Well, they thrive in uncertainty, and this is hyper fertile ground for rumors because of all the uncertainty, the constantly changing information, the constantly changing restrictions. So that's part of the story. But also people are fed up, they're exhausted, they're angry, they're tired. Some people have lost jobs, other people, it's having a knock-on effect from a mental health perspective, from a societal perspective. And I think it's got to break somewhere. And I think it's come out in some of the protests. We see it in the emotions. What's been incredibly interesting and traumatic, but what's happening in Europe right now with the Ukraine situation is I see this Europe over the last 2 years that has not always agreed on everything in terms of every country has kind of slightly different policies. And the EU as a whole had some, uniformity, but It has, the sentiment has totally changed in the last week, 10 days around the Ukraine situation. And there's so much more uniformity, togetherness, focused. It's been really striking from a very fractured landscape. All the energy has had a very different focus. But to me, it's been, how quickly that can change has been striking.
So what does that tell us about how to deal with like COVID misinformation and vaccines going forward, right? It almost seems, I agree, I've seen the same thing that you're seeing, which is just like a very much more togetherness all of a sudden in a way that I haven't seen in a long time, which, you know, I had a conversation earlier with John Hagel about fear and how do you as a leader lead from a place of opportunity. A big part of his message is about, you know, well, you need to create a vision or a cohesion around opportunity as opposed to fear. And I'm curious how you think about that and how it might apply to future vaccination campaigns or broader picture, like releases of specific.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with him. I guess I wouldn't have said opportunity. I would have called it hope. I mean, if you're in the emotions spectrum. And what was interesting, we were on the ground in Brazil during the Zika outbreaks, and one of the things that we saw, and we didn't expect this, such a strong theme of a lot of the mothers who had these children affected with microcephaly, they talked about the importance of hope. When the health center, the physician gave them some hope that if they did some interventions with their children, that would make a difference. That motivated them. If they didn't have any hope, some of them would blame it on a bad vaccine. It's not really Zika. And in Bolivia, the campaign for COVID, the vaccine campaign was doses of esperanza, doses of hope. And I think if we can instill kind of that hopefulness, and I think right now we're in an absolutely crucial time. This is just aside from the Ukraine situation, the COVID recovery. And what's going to be super important is to just, people are sick of hearing about vaccines. I mean, it's enough already. That's all you talk about, right? I think we need to, and we were at this place with towards the end of polio. I mean, we're still not done with polio, but there was a point where people just didn't want to hear about it anymore because they say that's all you care about. You don't care about my kid dying of measles, or, you know, the fact that our family's sick because of dirty water, or we don't have electricity. And I think very much we're at a point in COVID that, you know, if we don't start listening to what people's broader issues are, whether it's mental health, whether it's their job, whether it's their, you know, whatever the situation, a lot of missed treatments that they didn't get because the health system was so focused on COVID. And if vaccines come into that mix, you know, okay, but they, you know, we need a kind of recovery plan, and that's going to need hope.
So you've had, I know you've done a lot of one-on-one conversations as a part of your career, talking to people all over the world about these issues and their personal circumstances, and spending a lot of time listening to them as opposed to talking to them. And I'm curious, you know, how you think about, there was also a study that you did in 2015 about the correlation between vaccine confidence in the countries with the highest education levels and countries with the lowest education levels. And actually, the highest education level countries were those that were more likely to be resistant to vaccine encouragement. And I'm curious how you think about that kind of like personal experiences that you've had with your own conversations, and that hesitation from an education standpoint is higher in those countries. How does that square with what you're seeing kind of on the ground?
Yeah, it's kind of a you know, the most educated and the least educated for different
Mhm.
reasons. But I think it's changed since then, the landscape. It's much more varied. It's
Yeah.
not really in any one age group anymore or any one economic. It seems um, it's interesting you reminded me of that, but because it really has gone across all spectrums now. And it's been very and with COVID, it's even more system wide. And it's been interesting in my listening. I've been increasingly, I'm a fellow at Davos with the World Economic Forum. And I've been talking, a number of CEOs have wanted to talk with me one-on-one on what they're facing in their employee bases, because they're facing a lot of anxious people, not just anxious about their jobs, but about coming back to the workspace and also their role in the community. And they themselves have, I mean, we forget that politicians, CEOs, they've got their own emotions. And so that's one thing that's really struck me, is that, you know, we often either wag our finger at the public for what they're not doing, and we're not looking at, you know, the different sides of the
Mhm.
coin. Um, what's been interesting to me is that you know, we're at an all-time low across the board with all the trust barometers that are out there.
Right.
Except that what's interesting is that CEOs and employers are far more trusted these days than government, which is an interesting shift. Um, Even more so than some media. So we've been kind of trying to work more with CEOs and their community of employees, and
Mhm.
trying to understand what will make them feel better coming back to work, or the nature of how they're working, and how can they move forward as a community. It's yeah.
And so what are your, like, let's say you're a CEO, what would your recommendations be?
Well, I mean, I usually recommend that the first thing to do is try to understand, you know, what the issues are. What are they feeling? Because um, they don't know. And one thing that I regularly find interesting is what their perception are, is not necessarily what their staffs are thinking. So we've been starting to do some listening with some employee bases, and then, you know, coming back to the employer and saying, well, actually, it may seem like things are fine, or that this is the issue, but really it's not so much of an issue. It's this that's really, um, you know, and they're not always, they've got a lot of things they have to handle, and they can't be listening to all their employees. So I get that. But it reminded me of one of my first my first jobs out of my PhD was in Silicon Valley, around the one computer per classroom. And I had to do, they were getting a lot of resistance from teachers in some settings for the one computer. And I did a lot of listening out in different work environments to come back and sit with the engineers and the technology people and say, you know, this is, yeah, it's an interesting time, but I feel like I'm kind of full circle coming back to that kind of dynamic listening.
So I'm curious, I mean, I think especially among the science and tech space, we are often used to being listened to, right? And this is especially true of CEOs. We were talking about this earlier. Their role is often perceived as being to always have the answer, to always have the way forward, or the next thing that everyone is going to do together. And you come to this from a very unique perspective, which is you have an anthropology background, which is a very different kind of way of thinking about things than the traditional business mindset. Do you have a set of recommendations for someone who is trying to implement some of your suggestions into their workplace or into their work?
Well,
Can you tell us how to listen?
pardon me?
I said, can you tell us how to listen?
Well, I think that it's not always um, sometimes you need an independent ear. Oftentimes you do, because people don't always want to say what they're really feeling to their boss. And I understand it can be an uncomfortable thing, especially if it's something that's some people are much less uninhibited than others. But sometimes it takes a neutral voice to come in and sit down with different groups and listen and see what's the sentiments, and to hear that management really does want to hear what they think, which is already something. And yeah, I think that's something to consider sometimes. And sometimes it's maybe within the company, employee groups that have their, peer focus groups or whatever. But we are not going to switch the light back and start business tomorrow after the last 2 years. No way. This is going to be a process. And even if it looks like it's coming back, we've got a lot of trauma, and it's not explicit. A lot of it is, it's going to take time. I think employers are going to have to be patient, because people are having a hard time, and and you don't know what they've been through at home, or in other situations. So I think we're going to have to take it slow, even though it's hard to think about, particularly in a fast-moving tech environment. But it's I don't think we should underestimate what the fragile state of things. I'm not saying and it could be a good thing. I mean, we can use it in a good way. And I think it's a time where actually, for employers and CEOs who get that, it's going to buy them a lot of longer term trust.
So I'm curious, you talked a lot about CEOs having higher trust levels than government. How do you see, like, if you were responsible for the US government at the moment, what would you do to restore?
I'm not. What?
What would you do to restore levels of government trust? Like, how would you approach that?
Oh, it's got to happen at a lot of levels. I think I actually had a long conversation with a colleague here in Washington about where the trust, because trust is relational, and I think the scientific institutions, the health institutions, there's a lot of I think the public is frustrated with the mix of different guidances that they've gotten. They don't always believe everything. How, there's some discussions about needing a separate entity on vaccine safety that's not coming from within the government, but really independent. Right. So I think there are ways that the government needs to look in the mirror and say, where are the weak spots and what are we going to do better next time? Because we might not have much time before the next time. So I think that's one thing I would start with.
And what are the weak spots that you see, other than like a separate entity you mentioned for oversight?
Well, I mean, I think that I think people, and this is another thing, is we see a lot in surveys and in focus groups that people say, I don't trust the CDC, or I don't trust FDA or whatever. And we need to start unpacking that, because right now there's not a lot out there. And that's really what I'm working on now is, well, what don't you trust about it? What is the issue? Because you see these barometers that are about trust, but it doesn't tell you what's really driving it. So right now, that's one of the things that I'm really working on is how do we understand, well, what is it? Is it the leader? Is it central government? Is it state government? Is it your local government? Is it, a particular institution? We've seen also, because science has never been in the forefront in the way it has been with COVID. I mean, it's been like the scientist in the ear of the politician. And that's, on the one hand, you could say, listen to the science, but the reality is, I think actually that politicians have listened too much only to the science and not to the other parts of human behavior. Because science is important, but human values are, societal preferences are. I mean, actually, one of the best examples that I've seen of integrating those has been in Indonesia. They had a rough time with the measles vaccine.
Are you taking
to, excuse me. Yes. They had a rough time with a measles vaccination campaign a few years ago. And it was because one or two Muslim imams didn't agree with it. They said it was halal, whatever. And it disrupted the whole thing. So when it came to the COVID vaccine, the government went through the usual regulatory processes for safety of the vaccine, and they approved it. But they didn't then say, okay, roll it out. They turned to the Islamic leadership and said, we want your blessings here before we roll it out. So they tried to touch on both some of the value aspects as well as the scientific. And I have a line in my book where it's kind of come to life in COVID, where I was saying that, in the Enlightenment, science was free thinking. Science was freedom from religious dogma.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, science has become the dogma, and that religion is like an escape from it. Ideology, these other, ways of thinking, and science. People say, science said, therefore you do. And in the context of COVID, science says, and therefore, here come the mandates, here come the restrictions. So there's been this tense relationship with science in a way that I haven't seen it for a while anyway.
Yeah, so there's been almost a transition to science being the authority without it being in touch with people's cultural or emotional values, essentially, which is an alienation. So when you look at, for example, just thinking about like this rebuilding of trust that you're describing that needs to happen, I think a lot of what we've described here and what I've seen and is that that rebuilding of trust often happens one-to-one, right? It happens in a personal conversation. Like, people don't change their mind about things necessarily based on you getting mad at them and arguing with them. They change their mind about things when they feel heard and listened to, and they can kind of have some space to sit with you in that conversation and feel like they're not being attacked. But how do you do that on a societal scale?
Well, I think that there's trust and there's trustworthiness. So I think people have to earn trust. And I think that's why we need to look at COVID recovery now as a time of showing your trustworthiness. And that's going to come out of action, not out of conversation, unfortunately. You can't persuade someone to trust you if they just don't trust you. They need to see that you're acting in ways that they feel they can trust you. And I think that's going to take some time.
Are there, you mentioned Indonesia. Are there other countries that you've seen do well with vaccine rollout where they've had less of an issue with this?
I would say less country as a whole, and well, Portugal and Spain have been exceptional. They, I think, have some of the highest uptake in the world, and that part of it's because they have there's a strong and trusting relationship with government, and
Mhm.
also, you know, they were hit pretty hard early with the pandemic, so they you know, when you know what it's like up front and close, and you've lost family members, and you know at least a few people in the block who you've lost, you know, your motivation's different. But I would say it's less about countries that did well and than localities. I think that there's been pockets of communities that have done better than others. I don't, there are some shining stars, I would say. I mean, Denmark's done well. Some of it has been more top down, but I think the best things have happened at hyper local level, where communities got together and just said, hey guys, this matters, or parts of communities. And we've seen actually what's been great to see is, I mean, I worked a lot in AIDS before I came into vaccines. And one of the things I found so powerful about AIDS was that the AIDS movement involved everybody, from miners to doctors to truck drivers to you name it. It was a very diverse engagement across all sectors. And it seemed like vaccines were so narrow and it's partly because of the nature of how they're delivered, but somehow in COVID, it's been a totally changed landscape because it affects everyone. And I think if there's one thing we should rescue from this, is keeping some of those different relationships, and not keeping it so, you know, narrow, so in the health system only.
So describe what that would look like.
What that would look like?
If you were to go back in time and start over, right? Like, let's say you were in charge of what the US, for example, how they rolled out their vaccines, what would you have done differently? What's your dream vaccine response look like?
My dream vaccine response. Well, I think part of the problem, challenge was, it's hard to blame people. I think there was a lot, the vaccine part was better than the overall mask and some of the other, you know, I think.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of
serious. Yeah, taking COVID serious and its threat serious. I think there was a lot of stumbling in the beginning, but you can't blame countries necessarily, because everybody was trying to, I mean, it's not an easy thing. But from a vaccine perspective, I think the real communication, the real engagement didn't happen till kind of vaccines were almost at the door. And when in fact we knew they were coming, we didn't know exactly when, but we probably could have done more early. I think that would have been probably good. But I think right now we have to look forward, because also politics has changed things in a number of settings. It's not the only country in the world where politics affected people's opinions about health. The fact that people are willing to kind of die for, you know, their ideology has been quite striking. So I don't think there's any one thing. I think moving forward, though, yeah. I don't know. I mean, I said there's some groups that there's a more obvious role for their continued engagement, and some maybe less.
So as you look forward to, you know, here we are looking at essentially a war in Ukraine, and you have Europe kind of gathering around that for the first time in a new way. You have the US over here also gathering around that, and I think a lot of support from Australia and Japan. and then you have China. What are the issue areas where you think this is going to be really important moving ahead? Like, how can we take some of these lessons and apply them to what's coming? Like, are there specific things that you think we should apply these lessons to, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think the most important thing right now is we need to recover. And when it comes to vaccines, I think the best way, one, I think we have to put vaccines in the context of other conversations, because we can't just go at it as only a vaccine, because people are tired of being, I mean, it's like a number, you know,
Right.
watching the numbers go up. But so I think we need to focus on humans. We need to get the heart back. We need to be with each other through this. And you know, I think particularly in the face of the war, we've got, you know, we're going to get something else coming down the pipeline, another natural disaster. And what's really concerning me is also that if we've been so unable to cooperate around a fatal pandemic in front of us in a relatively short term, 2 years feels like a long term, but when it comes to climate issues,
Yeah,
we've
it's
got
much
a
shorter.
lot longer haul. We're going to have a lot more severe restrictions. And we need to start thinking about what can we do better in terms of cooperation? What will motivate it? And that's really what I'm focused on now. I'm kind of not totally exiting the vaccine space, but I've learned a lot about people through the lens of vaccines over the last 12, 15 years. But one of the things I've seen, if you want to know whether someone trusts government, ask them if they trust the vaccine. It's been remarkable as a window. And I'm doing more also in security, but I've shifted with this new MacArthur Award from the Vaccine Confidence Project to the Confidence Project, because what I really care about is fundamental foundational confidence. And we're kind of broken at a number of levels, not everywhere, but we need to build on where the strengths are, where the hope is, bringing back the hope. And kind of, we're going to have to deal with some of the anger, some of the resent. France just did a fantastic study that I was presenting at Belgian Parliament when they were trying to decide about mandates. And what they did was they asked people, when you were vaccinated, did you feel relieved? Did you regret that you were getting vaccinated, or were you angry? And it was really striking the number of people who either resented it or who were angry. I had my vaccination and I was relieved. I was grateful that I could get it. But there were a lot of people, particularly in that last mile, people who hadn't lined up in the beginning, people who, you know, that last 10, 15%, you know, there was a reason it was the last 10, 15%. And, you know, they, some of them lined up and got it because they wanted to go to that pub, that rock concert, that whatever, that they knew they couldn't go to if they didn't get there. At least, you know, in some places you need to have your vaccine. And so they did it kind of resentfully. And the study came out and said, you know, just taking a vaccine doesn't mean people are confident. They're doing it at a very pragmatic way right now. And not everyone is, but so I'm really focused right now on trying to understand these underlying levels of trust and confidence, and how we can get societal cooperation in ways that we didn't really do well on in COVID.
I was talking about this the other night with Evan and a friend of ours, and I think one of the things that was maybe an unforeseen cultural outcome of COVID, which Dave Cornell, who has been in Rome, which is very strict with their coronavirus measures, just mentioned in the chat, is the isolation that everyone experienced, right? So normally when we go through an experience like this, we have our families and our communities to kind of process with and talk through things with, but that was not the case for most people during COVID. they were very isolated from their friends. They couldn't see each other in person. And I'm just curious how you think about that kind of physical isolation as we move forward. Like, how do we start to mend some of those barriers?
I think isolation was it's been a huge issue. I think we're going to see a lot of post-traumatic stress syndrome, not just at individual levels, but societally. I mean, Peter, my husband, was, isolated. You're in a position you don't know if you're going to live or die. You can't see any family members. You can't see anyone close to you. It's an awful thing for 10 some days, weeks for some people. And also people separated. I think there has to be ways we could have done this better in terms of the compassion and the feeling and the isolation. I think was too extreme, particularly when it came to people being kind of able to be with people suffering. And because it wasn't Ebola. I mean, we didn't need to go in there with, there are ways you could protect yourself and be able to be, I'm not saying, in a limited way anyway. So I think that's going to be the isolation piece has been a problem. I have a colleague who was a doctor in northern Italy, and she was saying that she went back to her village where her grandmother is and the family there, and her grandmother said was talking about the isolation piece, and she said, the war, it feels like the war when we had to, but the war was better. We had each other. We could take care of each other. We could console each other. We got through it together. She said this was much worse. And I get that.
Well,
we can do it better.
We have a few minutes left. We're about to start taking questions. There's a lot of really interesting conversation going on in the chat. I know we have a lot of questions. I think a lot of people are really resonating with that feeling of isolation and having to have family members in isolation at like the hardest times of their life or when they were dying. So if you have questions for Heidi, please drop them in the chat and we will get to them very briefly. But Heidi, I want to ask you, so as you think about this confidence project moving forward, if there are folks in this group who are interested in, I think I have personally had a lot of questions from people in the fire community who want to know, how do I talk to someone who is on the other side of the aisle from me when it comes to vaccines? Like, how do I convince people who I love and care about to get vaccinated? And I'm curious what your response to those questions would be.
I mean, I wouldn't go into the conversation with the intention to try to persuade them to get vaccinated. I think it's important to hear them out because there may be reasons that we wouldn't have thought about. They could have had a really bad experience. There may be something that we just don't know. So it would depend on what their answer is. One way I try to open a conversation where I anticipate there's probably going to be a difficult conversation is to try to find something you agree on. And start there. There's a lot you could talk to people about now. How are they feeling about what they went through, whatever, in a broader sense. And somehow in that conversation, you can bring in vaccines, but I wouldn't leap in. I never start by saying I'm going to go there and change their mind because I don't, maybe I won't, but maybe I'll listen to them and then they'll realize that actually somebody's interested in their perspective and maybe they'll go away and think differently.
It reminds me of, I'm trying to remember his name, a Black blues musician who he somehow met a member of the KKK at one of his concerts at a show of his. And this guy really loved his music, and they kind of had this conversation, and he was very nervous about the whole thing. But they wound up becoming friends. And that interaction inspired him to become a full-time kind of like deprogrammer of KKK members. And he's actually gone into that. I'll put a link in the chat, but it's a very, super interesting story of how do you connect with someone who purportedly on the surface really not only doesn't like you, but kind of wants, has historically been known to kill you. It's a pretty amazing experience. Okay, Evan, let's go over to you for questions.
Yeah, so I'm just going to start at the top here. Greg, you had a question about what drives distrust in government. You want to ask that?
Yes, I do. I think we've kind of talked about this, but are there specific things that you're seeing that is causing distrust in government? I view it, for me personally, I've seen that the CDC and the FDA have presented misleading information or incomplete information. But I'm wondering if there's other sort of main themes that are driving this, because your point earlier was that the large thing that is causing people to not want to be vaccinated or whatever is distrust in government, as opposed to other things.
Or confidence.
Yeah, confidence in government. Yeah,
it can
exactly.
be a builder or a breaker. Yeah.
Right. So what happened that caused this massive lack of trust in the government? I have to say that personally, I found that 2 years ago, I totally trusted that the government was able to do a lot of things. And now I personally am a lot more skeptical. I'm willing to at least consider it, but now the default is not, oh yeah, they can deal with that. So what happened to me and other people?
Well, I mean, there's different reasons in different countries. And I mean, that's one of the things I was saying. I mean, what I'm working on now is trying to unpack what was it about trust? Was it the national leader? Was it the local leader? Was it the experience in the system? I mean, sometimes it's the people's personal experience where they actually do make the effort, and then the system lets them down one too many times. In some of the Black communities, in some of the discussion, they said, yeah, there was Tuskegee, but I ain't talking about Tuskegee. I'm talking about the way they treated me 3 weeks ago. This isn't just a historic thing. So people have their, people have different things, different reasons. Yeah. And so I think we've got a lot of learning to do there.
Thank you. Yeah. The next question is from Mary, and Mary, you had a question kind of about whether this is spreading amongst other forms of medical treatment. Do you want to ask that?
Well, the whole medical freedom movement, or health freedom, medical freedom movement didn't start around vaccines. It started around people wanting the freedom to choose alternative treatments, natural, alternative, whatever. And what's interesting, I think some people forget that. So there have been a lot, and that's the other thing we've been looking at. I've had our global mental health group come to me saying, help us understand why people don't want to stick on their psych drugs. I've had our big global statins group come and say, help us understand why people aren't, taking their statins. They seem so benign, but they can save their life, maybe, and coming from AIDS, where, we didn't have people, the idea that next time we're going to have a vaccine this quickly, who knows? Look at AIDS. 40 years later, we still don't have a vaccine, and it wasn't lack of money, wasn't lack of science. It's, it's a virus that's really complicated. We've managed to get drugs, and that's a miracle. But for a long time there, all we had was behavioral stuff. So I spent a lot of time in that space. But yeah.
That kind of actually runs into this question that Steve had, Steve Sherman. Steve, do you want to ask about, you're talking about history and like, you know, the history of governments being untrustworthy just in general, I think. Do you want to come up? Well, anyhow, that was it. So Steve said, historically, have governments been trustworthy? And I think his point is, you know, in human history, it's a little hard for people to trust governments when they look at, you know, the long spread. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, did you see any examples kind of in your entire career, you know, being an anthropologist as well, that kind of lead you to think that people aren't inclined to trust governments naturally?
I think there's a number of places in the world where people have a lot of trust in government. And actually, we've seen, you know, in, well, Finland, for instance, you know, there are certain countries that there's a lot of equality. There's a lot of people feel like there's fairness. They feel like they're supported, and there are trust, and you know, they're lucky, but they've also made efforts in it. And other countries, you know, they've had a rough road for different reasons. So I'm, you know, it's a hard thing to generalize, and that's one of the things I'm really interested in working on. And it's going to be really important for security reasons to understand these dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? That it depends on the government and what's going
Yeah.
on. Reddy, you had a question about how scientists can communicate. Do you want to ask that? I know you're here. I just saw you.
You asking?
Oh, there we go. Hello. Sorry, the question was fundamentally around, you know, if people are feeling hopeless. You used the word, Heidi, at the beginning of it, that you would replace the narrative with hope-based optimism. It's fun. If scientists typically don't truck in hope, right? It tends to be around data. And if the issue right now is that there are a lot of people who are feeling hopeless and see scientists as telling them more things that they can't do, it's probably not a huge surprise that they would be suspicious of it. So I guess the question really is, if right now, and you hinted at this at the end, if right now the world requires collective action, which is going to require sacrifice, right, from a lot of people, how do we inspire hope for that collective action?
Well, I think the more we can have examples of it, and that people are, I mean, when you think about like airline ads or whatever, you know, they're not giving you the specs of the seats and well, some of them do, but you know, what they do is they show you the beach, they show you the destination, they show you the mountains, they show you the beautiful palm trees, and you know, and so I think what we need to, rather than focusing on, you know, take this vaccine or pop this pill, or, you know, we should be talking about the other side of it. Like, what does recovery look like? Let's you know, get together with what do we want? You know, where do we want to be? And I think if we involve people in that, you know, looking forward, rather than these kind of pieces along the way, I think we'll get farther.
Bobbin, you had a question about kind of the human effect, and I don't know if we answered it, but you here? I'll read it out. So she said, with the COVID slog, a lot of local conversations stopped happening. And we were talking about this a fair bit in the chat too, Heidi, while you were talking about kind of the social aspects. No neighbor conversations over the fence or community gatherings. Could that have had an effect? And I guess a good follow on is kind of what kind of effect did you see in your work from all the isolation and kind of the lack of local and community cohesion?
Well, there were some over the fence, but there was the fence. You know, it's like there was a little bit of that going on, but not much. I get it. It was more online stuff. You know, I think about the world. Can you imagine 10 years ago, and 10 years ago is nothing, but even 10 years ago, we weren't at all equipped to have the nature of communication that we did during COVID. It's a miracle, actually. I mean, we are so lucky. When I think about like communicating in the hospital with FaceTime, I mean, to not have that, it's just not the same as just phone call, which could have even been difficult. But the fact that we've been able to be communicating virtually is already something, but that's not for everybody. And, you know, the other thing about the whole technology situation is, you know, we're lucky to have the technology and the access that we do, but there are a lot of families that might have had one device for big families, kids at home for homeschooling, 2 people, you know, and it created tremendous stress. I think we got a lot of catching up to do on education. There's going to be a lot of, I don't know, issues around that, but the isolation also, I think with children, there's going to be a lot, we're already seeing some developmental issues and some of them are too young to even talk about what has gone on. We've seen kind of behavioral expressions of it. So there's a lot of stuff that we're going to be, you know, fallout that we're going to have to be working with little at a time.
Yeah, I think the way that the pandemic has accelerated some forms of inequality, and that was a perfect example,
Yeah.
right? If you didn't have a computer for every kid in your house, then you're way behind now compared to other people who did. So we are out of time, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi. I think this was a great conversation. I love the holistic aspect of how many different things we covered about it. Thank you, Heidi. Again, we really appreciate your time. Berit, well done.
Thank you, Heidi.
And I
Okay.
will see you in the
Bye.
next.
Thanks, Berit. Cheers. Bye.